Hi, everyone who's already with us. We're just waiting for our Zoom room to fill up, so we'll wait for participants to log in. We'll get started in just a bit. In the meantime, please enjoy this wonderful cover art from Exercise by Daniel Lieberman. All right, I'll go ahead and get us started as people continue to join us. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia, a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore. We're live with Daniel Lieberman discussing exercise, why something we never evolved to do is healthy and rewarding. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question during this discussion, pop it in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the latter portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we don't have time for yours this evening. Before we begin, we really want to thank you out there for joining us. We're so thankful to our loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce our author. Daniel Lieberman is an Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences and a Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He is the author of the national bestseller, The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease. Tell us, does running ruin your knees? Should we do weights, cardio, or high-intensity training? In his myth-busting book, Exercise, Lieberman tells the story of how we never evolved to exercise, to do voluntary physical activity for the sake of health. Using his own research and international experience, Lieberman recounts, without jargon, how and why humans evolved to walk, run, dig, and do other necessary and rewarding physical activities while avoiding needless exertion. His engaging stories and explanations will revolutionize the way you think about exercising, not to mention sitting, sleeping, sprinting, weightlifting, playing, fighting, walking, jogging, and even dancing. Entertaining, enlightening, and constructive, exercise explores how our increasingly sedentary lifestyles have contributed to skyrocketing rates of obesity and disease. In order to become more active, we need to do more than medicalize and commodify exercise. Drawing on insights from evolutionary biology and anthropology, Lieberman explains how we can make exercise more enjoyable rather than shaming and blaming people for avoiding it. He also tackles the question of whether you can exercise too much, even as he explains how exercise can reduce our vulnerability to the illness and chronic pain. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Daniel Lieberman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. I'm really pleased to be here, and let's get started. Particularly in this really kind of amazing time to be in DC or anywhere in the United States. So let's just imagine that that this audience is representative of the United States, and if that's the case, then about 20% of you probably got your recommended 150 minutes of exercise a week. That's what the US government and most other major health organizations recommend. But the other 80% of us really hate exercise, right? And the result is that we're often ambivalent about it, we're confused about it, we're anxious, we're bullied. In a word, we're exercised about exercise. And so if that's you, don't worry. This is not going to be one of those books that tells you how to run a marathon and, with just 4 minutes of training a day and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to avoid a lot of that kind of standard, 7 easy steps to get ripped kind of book. Instead, my goal is to try to make all of us less exercised about the topic of exercise. But the first things first, I should thank my amazing editor, Errol McDonald, and agent Max Brockman. And then there's a whole slew of people who've helped me with the book in many ways. My wife, Tonya, who read every chapter actually, and other colleagues. And I need to really thank all of them. They really helped contribute to the book in many ways. Okay, so in the next 30 minutes, what I want to do is I first talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and what it's about. And then in the second part of the talk, I'd like to explore some of the myths of exercise. The book is not really about the myths of exercise, but I use each chapter. I use a myth as a way of as an entree, as a way of sort of getting into the topic and helping demystify and de-exercise exercise. So this book actually began pretty kind of, there was really a moment when this book began, and it started because I was finishing up my last book, The Story of the Human Body. And as I was kind of putting the finishing touches on that book, I was invited to participate in a medical conference that precedes the Ironman World Championship in Kona, Hawaii. And this is actually the view from the hotel where we stayed. As you can see, it was really just rough thing to do, to go to Kona to watch this amazing event. And I did not participate in the event, I was watching. And if you don't know about a full Ironman, they start with a 2.4 mile open water swim, which just gives me palpitations to think about. And then they jump out of the ocean and jump onto their bikes and then do a 112-mile cycle ride across a lava desert. And then by that time, it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and they jump off their bikes and do about a 26.2-mile run. So it's just an astonishing event to watch. Any one of those things is extraordinary. Combining all three together is an extraordinary endurance event. And when you watch an event like that, you realize, first of all, they're crazy, but secondly, why the motto of Ironman is anything is possible. And the year I attended, actually been there twice, but the first year I went in 2012, this is the guy who won. He's an Australian guy, I think, and he did this in a little over 8 hours, which is just astonishing, right? The fact that he even did it is amazing. But the most extraordinary, and look, he even looks like normal and happy, and he's like upright. But the most extraordinary finishes are at the end, because you have 17 hours to finish. You have to finish before midnight. And if you stay there till midnight and watch the last finishers, it's extremely emotional. And this was the last person to finish that year. Her name was Harriet Anderson. She was 77. And you can see she just barely made it before midnight. And she's being congratulated by the woman's winner. So, you go to something like that, you think, this is the limits of human endurance. Why would anybody do that? But when I left, I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to do that. I have no interest whatsoever in doing that kind of extreme event. So anyway, a few weeks later, I packed my bags and I was off to Mexico, where I was doing research among the Tarahumara Native Americans. They call themselves Raramuri. And I was traveling around with help of a friend, Mickey Mahaffey, and we were driving on these little pickup truck to remote pueblos and sleeping on floors. And I was measuring people's feet and had my little anthropological sort of question list for everybody. And the Tarahumara are very famous for running. But actually, I saw nobody running on their own, except when I asked them to do. And they're also famous for being barefoot, but I never saw anybody barefoot either. But I did get the chance to see some of their amazing races. So there's two races. One is called the Aruete, which you see on the bottom. It's the women's race. It's usually about a marathon in distance, about 25 miles. And there's a kind of little cloth hoop, which they flick with these sticks. And then there's a men's race called the Rarahipari, which is where they kick a ball. They flick it with their foot, and then they chase it, and they flick it with their foot, and they chase it. And those races can be anything from 20 miles to sometimes as much as 50 or 60 miles. They're quite remarkable races. So for them, running is really kind of a sacred task. In fact, it's a form of prayer, which is one of the main reasons why they do it. But otherwise, people don't run. And so I was, traveling around and measuring people's feet. And there was this one guy, this older fellow named Ernesto. Well, that's the name I'm giving him. That's not his real name. And he was. This is him running actually in the Rarahipari. He's in his 70s. And I was asking him about his, how he ran and how he trained. And I had been asking this question for all sorts of people beforehand. And everybody was really confused by my question about training, because there's no word for training in their language. And the translator I was working with was struggling, explaining this gringo, what he does is he runs 5 miles in the morning, every morning, to kind of get ready for running. And Ernesto looked at me at that point and he said, why would anyone run if they didn't have to? And I remember laughing a little bit out of embarrassment, but realizing, well, of course it makes sense. If you're a hardworking farmer, as all the Tarahumara are, and you're struggling to get enough food on your plate, why would you do needless physical activity? When they run because it's a sacred task, right? They don't do it for health and fitness. And so suddenly it kind of hit me in the face that the kind of exercise that I do is weird, right? And it's important to distinguish between physical activity, which is any bodily movement that expends energy, right? It's basically moving. But exercise is a special kind of physical activity. It's voluntary, it's discretionary. It's when you go and jog for several miles, or go on a treadmill, or do Zumba classes or something, primarily to sustain or you improve your health and fitness, right? It's a modern, commercialized, medicalized, industrialized behavior. And for me, the apotheosis of exercise is the treadmill, right? Think about it. It's a really weird modern machine. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on these things or spend a lot of money to go to a gym to use them. And they're boring and they're loud and they're noisy and they're slightly treacherous. Nobody really enjoys themselves on a treadmill unless they're like listening to a podcast or something like that. And you work really hard to get nowhere, right? Imagine explaining that to your great great grandparents or to a Tarahumara or to a hunter gatherer, right? It's just a really strange thing. And I had experience of that in the field site where I work. So I work, most of my research is in Western Kenya in a community called Pemja. It's an area way up high in the Western Rift Valley. In fact, this is the edge of it. And you can, if you see down in the distance, you can see Lake Victoria. And that's the town of Kisumu, where Obama's father is from. And in this town, people have, there's no electricity, there's no running water. Very few people have shoes. All work is done by hand. And women carry, especially women carry enormous loads. They carry firewood, they carry water. And so we were doing an experiment on how women carry things. And so we brought up a portable respirometry system so we could measure their oxygen. You can see on this woman. And to do the experiment, we thought, let's get a treadmill. So I bought a treadmill and drove it, way up into the mountains. It's not an easy place to get to. You can get a sense of what the roads are like from this little video. And then we started putting women on the treadmill. And if you've never been on a treadmill all your life and you're in mid 40s or something, it's very awkward, right? You don't walk really normally. And we realized that we couldn't get the experiment done on the treadmill and we had to abandon it. So all that time and money and effort was just wasted to get the treadmill up there, because it's a really strange thing, a treadmill, right? And by the way, if you didn't know this before, treadmills were invented. The modern treadmill was actually invented to punish Victorian prisoners, right? People like Oscar Wilde were forced to trudge for like 6-7 hours a day on treadmills, so just to make sure that they weren't enjoying themselves in prison. So if you think treadmills are torture, well, they were kind of designed to be a form of torture. So how do I end up running and thinking and studying and writing about the evolution of human physical activity? Here's some pictures of me in the lab and in my field, etc. And I thought, in a way, it's kind of to me, a very surprising thing that I do what I do, because I'm the quintessential nerd, and runt of the pack, right? This is a picture of me in, I think, 6th or 7th grade. I was not very athletic. I was kind of ashamed of my body. I literally, it's a cliche, but I really was pretty much all the time picked last for any team. I once hidden in a closet during gym class to avoid gym class, actually. And I was just not by any stretch of the matter an athletic person, but I did have some great role models. The biggest one was my mother, and of course I didn't realize it at the time. My mother was a professor at the University of Connecticut that built a very fancy new gym, and they wouldn't let women use the gym. And so she was actually one of the first Title IX cases. She started running, not because she liked running, but she started running as a way to use the gym, to liberate the gym, to allow women to use the gym. And so, but she got hooked, and eventually she became a very serious runner, and she ran 5 miles a day for about 50 years, and she's in her mid 80s and she still exercises every day. And I just thought, that's normal. That's what parents do. They run, and my father would run with my mother, etc. And also, we didn't, I wasn't encouraged to be on any teams or anything like that. But for family holidays, we would go hiking, we would go skiing in the winter, and so I kind of grew up thinking that it was normal for my parents to go jogging, and that it's normal to be physically active. But we weren't really engaging in that much kind of sports. So I kind of I was reasonably active. I used to jog a few times a week, but I wasn't very serious. And as I grew up, I became a professor, and my major topic of research was heads. I was a head guy, and I did lots of research on how heads are the way they are. And I got kind of interested in the topic of how humans hold their heads still when we run, because quadrupeds like this pig, when they run, they can sort of flex and extend their neck, but we're like pogo sticks. And so I was curious about how we did that, and we discovered there was this interesting anatomical structure called the nuchal ligament, and we did all these experiments in the lab. Here's a headless person in my lab running, and that got me interested in the evolution of running. And eventually in 2004, with my colleague Dennis Bramble from the University of Utah, we wrote this paper in the journal Nature entitled Born to Run. You can imagine that had quite a big effect, in which we argued that humans evolved to run long distances. It was an important part of human evolution. And then if humans evolved to run a few million years ago, they must have been running barefoot. So we got interested in barefoot running, and we published this other paper in Nature in 2010, also a cover article. And all of that kind of got me, really excited about the evolution of human physical activity, and I ended up writing my book, The Story of the Human Body, in 2013, which is really about the relationship between human evolution and human health and disease. And studying running also fostered my own interest in running, and I actually ran my first marathon in 2007. Here I am in my first marathon, struggling along, and then I sort of got interested in, as I mentioned before, in barefoot running, and I like to try what I study, so I started trying barefoot running and discovered I kind of enjoyed it. I don't, most of the time I wear shoes, by the way. And I also, since I was interested in running down animals, I'm not going to go hunt kudus in Africa, but I did join this race in Arizona, which I describe in the book, this man against horse race. And, I basically got interested in all this sort of stuff. But I also discovered that there was a lot of controversy, right? Paleoanthropology in my field is very controversial, but boy, you should try barefoot running. That's even more controversial. And I was kind of caught in the middle of this argument because on one hand, there were a bunch of folks who were arguing that basically if you wear a shoe, you're evil, and they're kind of corporate, coffins that people put on their feet, and that if you run barefoot, it'll be perfect. And then there were other people who were really angry and hated barefoot running and argued that you need support and cushioning for your shoes. And if you're a barefoot runner, you're probably like a communist or a polygamist or something like that. And most people were like in the middle. They were like totally confused, like what should they do? And it made me realize that we're very exercised about exercise, where people are vexed and worried and anxious and harassed. And in terms of barefoot running, for example, they want to know, is it better to be barefoot? And is running going to ruin their knees? And how much should they run? And more in general, how do they get off the couch? And how much weights or cardio should they do? And how much should they sleep? And, are chairs really bad for you? And how much should you sit? And I could go on and on and on and on. But the biggest problem is that not enough people get enough exercise. So only about 20% of Americans, according to the US government, get the minimum recommended dose of exercise, which is 150 minutes a week. So that's just 21 minutes a day. So the vast majority of us, 80% of us, aren't getting even a modicum of exercise. So that raises some questions. And one of them is, why are we so exercised about exercise? And I think part of that is because the information people get is totally confusing. Like one day you'll read about how good running is, and then the next day you read about how running is bad for you and will cause you heart disease. And the next day you'll read about how you need to do a lot of aerobic, cardio work. And then the next day you'll read about how important strength training is. And it just gives people whiplash, right? And you get this information in these tiny little, often contradictory packets. Another problem is that so much of what people read about exercise is about one thing and one thing only, which is losing weight. And to be sure, that's an important problem, but it's not the only reason to exercise. And it kind of gives you kind of a perverted, sort of overly focused view of exercise. There's also, I think, a kind of an overemphasis on elite athletes. And sure, it's just amazing and wonderful to watch the world's best athletes, do these incredible things. But I would argue that what elite runners and elite basketball players and elite weightlifters, et cetera, do has probably very little to do with what most of human beings are like, right? Their athletic performances are really kind of very extreme and not particularly useful for us. And maybe most importantly, there's a Western post-industrial bias in terms of how we think about physical activity and exercise, right? So almost all the data that we have about physical activity and exercise science comes from people like you and me, like people from America and from Europe and Australia. That's only about 10% of the world. Like the rest of the world doesn't live like us. And in fact, for most of human evolution, people didn't live like us. And so we're looking at a kind of a tiny sliver of humanity and generalizing those principles to all of us. So I thought, really what we need is to write is a natural history, right? What I would like to do is write a natural history of physical activity. And I have sort of two mantras. One is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, right? Our bodies weren't designed or planned, they evolved. And if you want to understand why they are the way they are, you have to understand that evolutionary history. And we're human beings. And if you want to understand human behavior, you need to think about them in terms of the light of anthropology. And so the natural history has 4 parts. And I begin with inactivity because if you want to understand physical activity, you first have to understand physical inactivity. And then I move on to aspects of physical activity that involve speed and strength and power, because those are kind of the original forms of physical activity. And then humans evolved to be exceptional at endurance, so that part 3 of the book is about walking and running and dancing. And then finally, I apply a lot of these ideas to human health. And to do all of this, I mix anthropology and evolutionary biology and human biology and health science. So there's lots of information in the book, but that's kind of boring. And so to kind of give it structure and narrative and a beginning, a middle, and an end, I try to use a lot of my own experiences because I've spent the last 20 years traveling around trying to see how people use their bodies, and often with participant observation to try to understand that by doing it myself. And so I try to weave throughout the book my own experiences with all this anthropology and biology. And so, and as a way of structuring the book, I have chapters on how we never evolved to exercise, and for inactivity, I talk about resting and sitting and sleeping, and speed and strength, and endurance and health. But for each chapter, I address an exercise myth. Now, the chapters aren't solely about exercise myths, but I use each chapter I choose a myth that kind of helps us kind of focus the discussion, and also to make people a little bit, again, less exercised about the topic of exercise. And so I'm just going to use through a few of those exercise myths as a kind of way of kind of zooming through the book to give you a kind of a flavor of some of the topics that I talk about. Of course, it's just a kind of a snapshot of what's really actually in the book, but hopefully it'll give you a sense. So let's begin with what most of us are doing right now, which is being inactive, right? Where maybe you're in an exercise cycle watching this, but the vast majority of us are just sitting, watching, or for that matter, giving this talk. And the biggest myth of all is that we evolved to exercise. Because remember, physical activity is moving, but exercise is planned physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. And our ancestors certainly were physically active, right? They walked all over the place. They carried, they ran, they dug, they danced. They did all kinds of physical activities. But it turns out that they're actually not doing that all that much. So when people have measured how much physical activity they do, it turns out it's only about 2¼ hours of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And for the rest of the day, they mostly rest. And furthermore, because in all of these societies, energy is limited. People don't have access to McDonald's and 7-Elevens and Whole Foods and whatever. They're struggling to get enough calories. And when you have only so many calories, if you spend calories on a needless 5-mile jog in the morning, that's like 500 calories. That's energy you're not spending on maintaining your body or on feeding your children or on reproducing. And so there's a strong impetus for people not to be physically active when it's neither necessary nor rewarding. And so that's why exercise is really a very modern concept. And so there's this little instinct that all of us have to not be active when we don't need to be. And you can see that all the time, all over the world, right? A good example is, one of those like subway stops or malls or airports, et cetera, when there's a stairway next to an escalator. Now, obviously there were no escalators in the Stone Age, but all of us have this instinct, this basic and primal and fundamental instinct to avoid unnecessary physical activity. So people in the subway stop, they're all basically lining up to take the escalator. And in fact, in this image, there actually wasn't many people. There's only one person here climbing the stairs of the image, but you couldn't see her. So I actually had to Photoshop this other person into the picture. But let's be compassionate of ourselves, because all these folks, we have there's a lot of virtue signaling about physical activity and about exercise. But sure, maybe there are benefits to climbing the stairs like this woman, but these people are actually normal, and this person, who of course has been photoshopped in, is actually abnormal. So another myth is that when you're not physically active, we're sitting, of course, most of the time. And recently we've demonized sitting. Sitting has been called the new smoking. And a lot of us are like worried about how much we sit, and we buy standing desks and treadmill desks and we're made to feel bad about sitting. But it turns out, so if you walk into a hunter-gatherer camp, and this is actually what I saw the moment I walked into this camp of Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, they're all sitting, right? And it turns out, studies by Dave Reichland and company have shown that Hadza hunter-gatherers who don't own chairs sit about 9 to 10 hours a day, which is pretty much as most Westerners. Here are these two very bored, somewhat suspect human beings who also are sitting a huge amount, but they probably actually sit more than most of us. But humans today aren't actually sitting all that much more than humans in the Stone Age. And so let's not demonize sitting, although it turns out that there are better and there are worse ways to sit. And in the book, I discuss all that. So interrupted sitting and all that kind of stuff. And I also got interested, if we're told to sit less, how come we're also told to sleep more? And I got really interested in that issue. And it turns out that that there's this myth out there that Thomas Edison and light bulbs and TV and iPhones and all that sort of stuff have robbed us of sleep. But anthropologists who've gone out and measured how much people sleep in places where there is no electricity, turns out people in non-industrialized parts of the world actually don't sleep 8 hours. They sleep about 5.7 to 7.1 hours a night. And furthermore, when I started looking at the literature, if you look at sleep, not just self-reported sleep, but also measured sleep against people's health outcomes, like, for example, how likely they are to get heart disease, it turns out that for populations, there's a U-shaped curve, and the bottom of that curve is actually around 7. So, of course, there's some variation. Some of us need 8 hours, some of us need 6 hours. But it turns out that the average is 7 hours is actually optimal in terms of long-term health. So this idea that you need 8 hours of sleep is a completely made-up, not modern myth, but we use it actually to make people exercise, because people think, oh my God, I'm not getting enough sleep, and then they go out and they buy all kinds of fancy devices and things to clip on their nose and fancy mattresses, and worst of all, they buy sleeping pills, which are really, really, really terrible. Okay, so the first part of the book is about inactivity, and then the next section is about really what our ancestors evolved to, our deep, deep, deep ancestors evolved to be, which is fast and strong. That's what most animals are. And so there's this myth that normal human beings, for example, trade off speed for endurance, right? And this is a good example of the over focus on elite athletes, right? So this is Eliud Kipchoge on the left. He's the world's fastest marathoner, and he can run a marathon in about 2 hours, which means he's running about 5.9 meters a second, right? Which is like a 440 mile, right? This is extraordinarily fast. Very few people can run a single mile that fast, and he runs it for 26 miles. And this, of course, is Usain Bolt, the world's fastest 100-meter runner, and he can run 100 meters in 10.4 meters a second, right? Which is under 10 seconds. Now, if Kipchoge were to run the 100 meters, he would run in 16.57 seconds, which is not very, very fast. And if Bolt were to run a marathon at his racing speed, he'd run one in a little over an hour, right? So obviously, for elite athletes, there's a definite trade-off, but for the rest of us, that's absolutely not true. In fact, it turns out that people who are generally faster also have more endurance. And furthermore, over the last few years, we've learned that probably the best way to build up your endurance is actually to work on your speed, right? And it's called high-intensity interval training. And there's a lot of information in the book about how that works and why it's so healthy. So one of the big lessons about physical activity is that it's always good to mix it up, right? Don't just do the same thing every day. If you go out and want to jog slowly every once in a while, every day, that's fine. But if you put a little speed work in, you'll actually build up your endurance as well. Another myth out there is that we evolved to be super strong, right? This is sort of like the CrossFit idea, right? That our ancestors were jacked and really, 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 muscly. But actually, when you go out and measure hunter-gatherers, again, that turns out not to be true. To be sure, they're reasonably strong, but they turn out to be about 75th percentile compared to, say, Americans, or if you graph them against Brits. But the important thing is that they tend not to lose their strength as they age, right? So as they get older, they tend to keep that strength much more than Americans and others in Western. And that's because they're continuing to use their bodies, because muscle is one of those tissues for which use it or lose it applies, right? Muscle is a very expensive tissue. About 20% of your metabolism is just spent paying for resting muscle. And so you don't want to have any more than you need, but you want to be able to build up more when you need it. And so if you don't use the muscle, you lose it. And that becomes a real problem in our society as people get old, because they get a disease called sarcopenia. Sarco means flesh and penia means loss. So it's flesh loss, right? And that basically means frailty. So as people get older, their muscles, they get less strong, they have difficulty getting out of chairs. And of course, that makes it harder for them to do other tasks, which leads to a vicious cycle, and they become less physically active, and that's a bad thing. So that's one of the reasons why we argue, why many health organizations suggest that you do at least 2 sessions of weight training a week, especially as you get older. So another myth out there is that sports is a form of exercise, and that can be true, but for really, exercise evolved to teach people skills for combat. Think about the Olympics, right? And think about various kinds of sports that are very popular, like football and hockey and whatever. And I describe this as an ancient Florentine sport that's still played today called the Calcio Florentino. But these are skills for combat, for soldiers. And the other argument I make is that a lot of sports are really to teach people, to teach kids especially, to be good sportsmen, to not be reactively aggressive, right? So if the other team scores a goal, it's not appropriate to hit them, right? You learn that. Instead, we learn to be effectively proactively aggressive. We can find out more about that in the book. Okay, and so from speed and strength and fighting and things like that, I move on to endurance, because if there's any one basic fundamental physical activity that humans evolved to do, it's to walk. Average hunter-gatherers walk 6 to 9 miles a day, right? Which is enormous. If you're a hunter-gatherer who walks 6 miles a day, a typical female hunter-gatherer, that means you're walking from LA to Washington, DC every year. That's normal, right? Often carrying stuff too. So if there's, it's just fundamental. It's who we are as a species. And so walking is really healthy, but there's recently been a kind of a pendulum swing against walking, because it's been argued that walking isn't very good for losing weight, because if you walk, you get hungry, and if you walk a mile, you spend only 50 calories, but if you get like McDonald's French fries, you're getting like 365 calories. There's no way you're gonna lose weight through walking. But again, if you take an evolutionary perspective, you'll think a little bit differently about this, because yes, it's true. If you want to lose weight fast, you're better to do it through dieting. But it doesn't mean that you can't lose weight walking. And the reason for that is that a lot of the studies that look at walking and weight loss look at that, standard minimum recommendation of 150 minutes a week, which is just 21 minutes a day. And if you walk 21 minutes a day, it turns out you might lose about half a pound a month, which translates to 6 pounds a year. Which, if you're trying to lose 50 pounds, which is what the average American is trying to lose, is not very much. But again, 21 minutes a day from an evolutionary perspective is peanuts, right? If you look at a more evolutionary normal dose, which is still not extreme, of just 300 minutes a week, so that's 42 minutes a day, you'll lose a pound a month, which is 12 pounds a year, which is not insubstantial, especially if you keep it up for a few years. And further, what's even more important is that although you're much better off losing weight through diet than exercise in terms of effectiveness, exercise is really important for preventing weight gain or weight regain. And most diets fail because people lose the weight and then they gain it back again. This is a famous study that was done here in Boston. They looked at Boston policemen, and they were put on an 8-week diet, and some of them had to diet, some dieted plus having exercise. And then afterwards, the ones who didn't exercise pretty much all regained their weight, but the ones who continued to exercise after the diet was over kept the weight off. Right? And that's been shown over and over and over again. So what really, the key benefit is to prevent weight gain or regain. So if walking is the fundamental moderate form of physical activity, the fundamental form of vigorous physical activity that we do is running. And yet there's all kinds of myths about running. And one of them is that it's like a wear and tear problem, right? It's like your car, right? If you drive your car too much, you wear out the shock absorbers. If you run too much, you're going to wear out the shock absorbers in your joints, that is the cartilage in your knees. And while it's true that the knee is the most common site of injury for running, I believe that a lot of those knee injuries are caused by people not running very well. I think running is a skill. There's a right way to run and a wrong way to run. And if you run a lot, you're going to get into trouble if you don't run properly. And the book talks about what's the right way versus the wrong way to run. And in terms of arthritis, in terms of the wear and tear argument, there's just no evidence for that at all. In fact, study after study after study, prospective, randomized control, prospective studies show that running does not make you more likely to get arthritis. In fact, if anything, it's slightly protective. We published a paper a few years ago showing that actually as physical activities levels have dropped, arthritis levels have actually gone up, right? So that you're now twice as likely to get arthritis at a given age and a given weight today than you were if you had been born before World War II. Another myth about endurance is that it's normal to be less active as we age. In fact, this is probably the most important myth in the book, because we have this idea that it's normal as you get older to kind of to take it easy, right? We have this concept of retirement, and I don't know, move down to Florida and hang out on a beach, right? But in the Stone Age, there was no such thing as retirement. There were no holidays. There were no weekends. People worked every single day in order to get the food that they needed. And it turns out that hunter-gatherers, if they survive childhood, tend to live about 2 decades after they stop reproducing, into their 70s or so. And that grandparents who are no longer reproducing actually tend to work harder than parents because they're producing a surplus of food and they're not dealing with kids in the first place. And they give that extra surplus to their children and their grandchildren. So I actually believe, and I actually argue in the book, that our ability to live to old age is actually not just a cause, but also a consequence of increased physical activity, and that's really important to be more active as we get older. And there's plenty of data to show that. In fact, one very famous study, the first famous study to show that, was the Harvard alumni study. It was done by this guy named Ralph Paffenbarger, who realized that alumni of universities are a great place to study this because alumni offices keep track of alums, and Harvard is especially does that because they really want as much money as possible from the alums. And so Paffenbarger convinced the alumni office to let him get data on alums and find out how much exercise they were doing, and also figure out how long they lived and what they died of. And what he showed was that alumni who were more active, so this is physical activity in terms of calories per week against the rate at which people were dying. And when you're young, being more physically active lowered your death rate by about 21%. But by the time you got to your 70s or 80s, the alumni who were more physically active were dying at half the rate as those who were more sedentary. So the older you get, the more important physical activity is. And then finally, the last section of the book is about how to apply all of this to health in the modern world. Right? And so one of the myths that I tackle is that just telling people to exercise and advising people to exercise and giving them Fitbits and the Western kind of industrialized, commercialized, and medicalized approach that we take to exercise clearly is not working. And the proof is in the pudding, right? 80% of Americans don't get even 150 minutes a week of physical activity, and they don't like it, and they don't like being nagged about it. They don't like being made to feel bad about it, and we're not really. But they most of them want to do it, and they complain about how they struggle to do it. And I argue that really a much better approach, if we want to help people be more physically active, is to make it both necessary and rewarding, right? Which is why we evolved to exercise, right? People were physically active because they had to, and they were physically active when it was fun. And so I think the best ways to help people be more physically active are to make it necessary and rewarding. And I go into great detail in the book about how to do that. And then the other question people always want to know about is how much should I do, right? That's the most often question I get. And the answer is there's no answer, right? It depends on who you are and what you want to do and what your goals are, and whether you're old or whether you're young, and whether you're male and whether you're female, when you live in the suburbs, and whether you have injuries, and whether you want to lose weight, and whether you care more about Alzheimer's or heart disease or diabetes. But with all those kinds of variations, remember, there's a few basic things to know. And the first is that it doesn't really matter how much you do. Anything you do is probably better than none, right? And so this is a graph based on over 1 million people. It shows the relative risk of death. It does not go down to 0, by the way, because that means you wouldn't die, right? And against how much exercise you do a week. And you can see that if you just exercise 60 minutes a week, you have almost a 40% reduction in your rate of death. And if you do 150 minutes a week, that's where you get that, which is what the government recommends, you get a 50% reduction. And if you do more, like 350 minutes a week, well, you're going to get even more, et cetera, right? And then eventually it levels off. And there's some argument about whether you can exercise too much, although there's actually no very good evidence for that. So some is better than none, and more is a little bit better, but eventually the benefits diminish, but it's different for every disease. And that's really what the final myth is about, which is that exercise is a magic bullet against disease, which is what you sometimes hear, right? And it's true that, and I don't want to, argue otherwise, there's a lot of compelling evidence that exercise really does lower the risk of many diseases, right? Heart disease, respiratory tract infections, which we're all interested in now because of COVID, cancers. I mean, the best way to prevent cancer is through physical activity. 150 minutes a week can lower the incidence of breast cancer by, according to some estimates, between 30 and 50%. By far, exercise is the best way to prevent Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes and arthritis and osteoporosis and depression. The evidence is enormous in favor of all these diseases. But with all that said, it's not really that exercise is a form of medicine. It's rather that it's the absence of physical activity that makes us more vulnerable to these diseases. So you can get them even if you do exercise, and you can avoid them sometimes without exercising. It's just that your vulnerability is increased by the absence of physical activity. And in the book, I explain in detail, but without jargon, and hopefully in a kind of fun and approachable way, just how and why that is the case. But that's much too long for a lecture today. So what I hope the book accomplishes is it informs and enlightens, and entertains you. And I hope that it helps us change as a society how we think about exercise in particular, but also about the science of health. I think we oversimplify things. I think we're very biased towards Westerners and elite athletes and towards weight loss. I think it's overly commercialized and medicalized. And there's nothing wrong with necessarily medicalizing exercise or even selling it, but I think we do it too much and it's not always effective. And I think we're often uncompassionate and very judgmental about people. There's too much virtue signaling about exercise. And finally, I hope the book is useful. I hope it helps you help make decisions about how to make exercise fun and necessary, and how and why it can be healthy and rewarding. And for me, one of my heroes is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She lived to be 87, and one of the reasons she stayed so strong for so long was that she was regularly in the gym, exercising and staying healthy. And most fervently, I hope that you enjoy being active and don't be exercised about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel Lieberman. I'm going to give you some applause. That's one thing I about live conversations. Again, anyone out there listening, tuning in, what a fascinating discussion. If you want to get your copy of Exercise from Politics and Prose, make sure you check the link in the chat. And we're now going to enter our Q&A portion. So if you have a question for Daniel about the book or its topics, go ahead and drop that in, and we'll just get started with a few. First up, voted up, Daniel, someone writes, we tend to think of advances in automation, thus cutting back on grueling manual labor, as more evolved. If we're veering too far in the opposite direction, are we actually de-evolving as a species?
Well, I mean, there's no precise definition of devolution, right? But it's true that machines have been replacing humans in all kinds of ways, and physical activity is one of them. So the question is, to what extent does that cause changes in our bodies? And you have to distinguish between two kinds, right? There's the kinds that are as a response to our environment. So, how much you use your muscles, right? If I use my biceps more, they'll get thicker and bigger and stronger, right? And if I don't use them, they'll atrophy. So there's these kinds of responses but you don't pass those on to the next generation, right? But for devolution, I think most people by devolution mean that there's actually selection going on, right? And that only happens if there's two conditions met. First of all, there has to be a heritable basis for the variation. And secondly, it has to affect your reproductive success. And most of the effects of sort of physical inactivity don't really kick in until we're like into our 50s and 60s and 70s. At which point we've stopped reproducing. So the evidence that they're having much of an effect on natural selection is kind of minimal. I don't suspect so. So a lot of people wonder if looking at our cell phones, we're all going to like change your hands or whatever. That's Lamarckian. That's not going to happen, right? But it's going to mean that we're if we're staring at our cell phones, it could have other effects on our bodies that will affect whether we need glasses or we trip and fall in the street or I guess selfie deaths. That's a problem, right? Interesting question.
It is. Another interesting question. Someone writes, you say that good and bad form affects the impact of running on the body. Why wouldn't evolution lead to running in good form and instead of leaving us learning always what's a good way to run? Why do we keep having, I guess, this bad knee problem? Can't we evolve to just figure it out?
That's a great question. So I think running is a skill, right? Just like throwing. Throwing has been important for millions of years, right? But you have to learn to throw properly. You have to practice for years and years and years and years. And running is also the same. If you just run, a few yards, it's not a big deal. But if you're going to run 5-10 miles, that's a different thing. And you have to learn to run properly. And I think one of the reasons that we don't run so well today is because of shoes. And I'm not opposed to shoes, but shoes have a lot of cushioning. And it means that you can kind of run in a way, you can kind of get away with bad running, right? So so the thing is, I think one of the keys to running is to run lightly and gently, not to crash into the ground. So if somebody's running and they're like thumping into the ground, they sound like an elephant, that's a bad sign. That means that each one of the time they're hitting the ground, there's like a big collision. There's a big exchange of energy between their body and the ground that causes a shock wave to transmit up the body. It causes injury, it causes damage. So I think that one of the best ways of actually learning good running form is actually to take your shoes off. You get this kind of free, natural coach. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to run well. But of course, the other way people learn skills is by imitating people who are good, right? See somebody who's, in Kenya where I work, right? The way people run is they run in groups, and they actually run in a line, and people imitate the runner in front. And they imitate his or her form, how he or she runs. And it's a great way to learn how to run. So a flock of Kenyans running looks like that, like a flock of birds. They all look the same. But if you go to watch a bunch of Americans run, everybody running differently. We don't have that cultural notion that there's a right and a wrong way to run, and that there's a kind of that to imitate each other.
I just had like a flash image of like a big marathon, and my brain went, oh, remember marathons? Like when people would gather.
Yeah, back in
the
old days.
But that's true. They all look different, different forms when they're running. Chaz has written, how do, quote, passive exercises such as yoga or Tai Chi fit in with what you've learned?
Oh, well, I think every kind of exercise is good. They're different, right? I wouldn't say that yoga or Tai Chi are passive. They're just, it's less vigorous. And, the more we study physical activity, the more we realize that there's so many different kinds, and often it's the variety that's good. So, first of all, it's most important to do what you like. And secondly, it's, if you can, to mix it up a little bit, and it confers benefits. So there's nothing, it's all good.
Yeah. Speaking of that, when you were studying or researching on this topic, have you seen forms of exercise that we would call modern, that you're like, oh, that person or this group is really like going about this in a new creative way for our time? Like they're really like getting that gardening in, they're walking their dog with vigor. Anything creative like that that sparked your interest?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so many interesting ways that people have to exercise. I mean, running upstairs, and one of the things that during the pandemic, people in apartment buildings in cities have been doing is running their stairs, right? I mean, that's a great way to get vigorous physical activity. I mean, just during the pandemic, the kind of creativity that some people, turning their living rooms into gyms, and using, we couldn't get weights online, so people have been using, items from their kitchen, as weights. And there's just 1,000 ways to be physically active. And I mean, just look at all the kind of interesting, people are exercising together on Zoom. I mean, that's creative. That's the thing. There's so many ways to be physically active, and I think that the best way to be physically active is to enjoy it, right? And the best way to enjoy it is to do it with other people usually. And so it's often the kind of interesting social innovations that I think that are really impress me the most.
Yeah, I agree. There have been an amazing amount of Zoom exercises that are pretty inspiring. We talked about this briefly at the beginning of this discussion, but someone wants to know if you have suggestions for this quarantoned phenomenon and how to stay active without risking over exercise with your apartment pots and pans weights. Because doctors have been seeing that a little bit about wear and tear.
Well, I mean, first of all, I suspect that applies to very few people. The vast majority of people are struggling to get enough.
Yeah.
There's not that many people getting at the other end of the extreme when they're doing too much. That's kind of such a small percentage of the world that it's almost it's probably not that important. But that said, I think that it's kind of it's not that hard to appreciate that a lot of injuries that occur in physical activity come from some combination of doing something repetitively over and over and over again. And so repetitive stress injuries are when our bodies never evolved to do the same thing over and over again. I think it's one of the reasons why treadmills and running on pavement is more injurious than, say, trail running, right? Because in a trail, every step is a little bit different, but on a treadmill, every step is the same. Just like typing, every time you type, you're kind of doing the same motion over and over and over again, and that can lead to repetitive stress injuries in your wrist. So that's one issue. So doing the same thing over and over again. But the other is just kind of doing you have to match capacity to demand. And it turns out that, if you, it takes a time, our muscles respond faster than say our bones and our ligaments. And so people can get stronger faster than, say, their ligaments and can handle the stresses, and then they get tendonitis and ligament injuries, etc. So doing too much too fast is a frequent recipe for injury. And I suspect, you're bored and you're trying to do stuff and you're feeling stressed, and so in quarantine, and so you're going to end up doing too much, and surprise, surprise, you injure yourself. But that would be the true in if you did anything else. If you just if I were to go out tomorrow and try to lift too much weights, I would definitely injure myself. I'm a weakling.
Carolyn has a follow-up question about that. She says, walking in a city might be the same thing over and over again, since the landscape might not change that much. And is that a problem with this idea of doing exercises not too repetitive?
Well, I mean, there's two issues. Is it repetitive emotionally, or repetitive in terms of physically? I mean, walking is not that stressful, so I don't think there's that much evidence that walking in a kind of an urban environment leads to. It's not like running is a much more stressful. So I think running, and and people run on streets all the time and they're doing just fine, right? So I just think it just increases your vulnerability. I mean, we all know what's kind of good for us and what's bad for us, and we're all different. And if you walk a lot and you don't get injured, you're fine, right? But there's no question mixing it up is also good. So,
absolutely.
I think I think we should have to be so less exercised about exercise.
Yeah, it sounds like we all need to just take a deep breath and be like, we're just doing stuff with our bodies. It's fine. Yeah. Nancy has written in, can mild but consistent exercise be the best way to lose substantial weight, or is lifting weights and high intensity interval training the best way to lose weight, even though it might be less fun? So,
all right. So again, for losing weight, exercise is helpful, but dieting is more effective. But exercise is important for keeping the weight off. That's basically. But you can lose weight slowly and gradually and gently and really it's cardio that helps you lose weight more than weights. And certainly the more we learn about high intensity interval training, the more we learn its benefits. But again, there's a trade-off between the intensity and the time and how many calories you burn. It's just very hard to do a long, hard, high intensity. You can't do that all the time, right? So you want to kind of mix up moderate intensity cardio with occasional vigorous physical activity, and they'll both have benefits. So, for example, if you're trying to burn visceral fat, which is belly fat, abdominal fat, which is the fat that's really the most problematic. That's most fat is actually not unhealthy. Fat in your buttocks and fat in your legs, etc. That's very inert. That's not really causing many problems. It's the fat around the center of your body that's really problematic. And there, sort of vigorous cardio really turns out to be really beneficial. So if you really want to burn that, do that. But again, be careful, especially if you're doing high intensity interval training and you're not in great shape. That's where you do want to talk to a physician. Make sure that you're doing something sensible, because you can overdo it. It's not easy.
Neil wants to know, do you view the benefits of standing up for a few minutes throughout the workday as a myth?
No. So I have a long section of that. So chairs aren't out to kill us, and it's not abnormal to sit, but there are healthier and less healthy ways to sit. And I describe in the book, and I go into great detail about why and how that is the case. But interrupted sitting is much healthier than long, sort of non-interrupted sitting. So fidgeting, getting up every 5-10 minutes. I mean, there's a famous study where they had two groups of people. They studied them over long periods of time, and they compared the individuals who were forced to get up every 10-12 minutes versus the ones who were basically sitting for bouts of 30 or 40 minutes. And the ones who were getting up regularly had lower rates of heart disease. And it's good to get up every once in a while. It's kind of like, it's like turning on the engine of the car. You kind of use up some of the sugar in your blood and the fat, and you kind of turn on the metabolism of your body. So interrupted, sort of what we call active sitting, is unquestionably better for you than long-term passive sitting.
Someone wants to know a little bit more about the relationships between sleep and exercise and health. So you talked
Ah.
about maybe the exact amount of hours of sleep being a myth, but should we be getting like a healthy blend of all of them? Maybe so.
I'm not, I really don't like being prescriptive. In the book, I try very
Right.
not I try to argue against this kind of prescriptive, medicalized approach. That said, the big enemy of sleep tends to be stress, psychosocial stress, which elevates cortisol, and cortisol makes you alert, right? It's the hormone that gets turned on when a lion is chasing you, or people, take over the Congress or something, right? All of us had a cortisol surge, and cortisol makes you aroused and makes energy available for you, and prevents you from sleeping. But cortisol can come from psychosocial stress, right? So telling people that they're not getting enough sleep or that they should be worried about their sleep makes them stressed, which then makes them less likely to sleep, right? But one of the best ways to fight that kind of stress is to actually exercise, because exercise, although elevates your cortisol while you're exercising, you then get a response to that, which then lowers your cortisol levels. So people who are regularly active actually have lower baseline levels of cortisol. And we all know this, right? If you go for a run earlier in the day, or go hiking or jogging or swimming or whatever it is you like to do, you're often just calmer, right? And you end up, we all sleep better. There's tons and tons of studies which show that exercise helps people sleep better. And if you're exercising a lot, if you're a professional athlete, you really need to sleep even more, right? So there's no simple blend. But if you wake up in the morning and you're feeling refreshed and you don't like fall asleep all day, that means you're probably getting enough sleep, right? We all know when we are sleep deprived and when we're not. And if you're, getting 150 minutes of physical activity a week, you're getting a good baseline. You might want to get more if you'd like to. And beyond that, relax.
Maybe one or two final questions here. Someone wants to follow up. Is the goal to minimize cortisol as much as possible? Is there any practical use for it these days other than to keep you from tossing and turning at night?
Well, cortisol is important, right? If you go for a run or go swimming or whatever, your body's going to produce cortisol to get the energy that you need, right? Cortisol is normal, right? And cortisol is useful if your building catches fire, you need to run out of it or something like that, right? So cortisol has benefits when it's acute, when it's temporary, when it's short term. Cortisol is pernicious when it's chronic and it's slow, it's elevated very slightly for very long periods of time, and that causes a wide range of problems. And so often in our society we treat the symptoms rather than the causes of things. And so instead of lowering our cortisol levels through cognitive behavioral therapy and through exercise and through sleep and all those sorts of things that help us be calm, we end up taking sleeping pills, and we end up taking other kinds of medications that don't deal with the actual fundamental cause of the problem. And so all of these things are normal, but they're pernicious and they're dangerous when they're chronically elevated as opposed to temporarily and briefly elevated.
Well, thank you so much. Before we sign off, Daniel, besides this fantastic book, Exercise, we always like to ask at PNP, is there anything you're currently reading or would like to suggest that people look into in addition to this fantastic new book?
Oh gosh, what am I? I'm reading a really cool book by a colleague of mine called The Weirdest People in the World, which is...
That one's on display here, yeah.
Oh yeah, so it's a really fascinating book. Actually, it's right here by my desk because I've been reading it. There's this book, but I sort of talk about it in the book, but it's just come out. But it's about my colleague Joan Henrik. But it's about how weird for him is Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Weird, and it's really so he talks about how there's bias in terms of psychological research about sort of weird people, but he also has this fascinating argument about how the church and changes in marriage laws caused changes in sort of Western culture that kind of led to our kind of to various aspects of Western culture. It's a fascinating read.
Sounds like it. Everyone, Run, don't walk to get your copy of Exercise
No,
by
walking is
Daniel
fine.
Lieberman.
Walking is fine.
Walking is also fine. You can also follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from Politics in Prose. We really want to thank Daniel Lieberman and our audience out there. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this kind of amazing programming. And we wouldn't be able to host these events without the book sales to support them. Again, follow the link in the chat if you'd like to order that directly from our website, or you can visit politics-prose.com. While you're there, make sure you check out our events calendar for what's coming up next in January and the rest of the year. And from one bookseller to book lovers everywhere, we hope you're out there staying strong, staying safe, and staying well read. We will see